I think if we were looking at 1983 Queensland politically, it would be fair to say it was a tumultuous year. One of the fascinating things though about the cabinet records is how little of that tumult is conveyed in the written records. There were certain key areas where there was a lot of infrastructure construction. So the whole South Bank exercised the cultural precinct. The infrastructure that we think about in 1983 are things like power stations, coal terminals, railway lines. There was probably a lot by comparison with previous years, but if you look at how Brisbane developed, say during the 1990s, it was not that busy at all. We're in the lead up to Expo, and it's really Expo that puts Brisbane on the map and just these fundamental changes in the city. The main thing is the amalgamation of the site. So a resumption, purchase, various mechanisms for actually gaining control of the South Bank site. There is also the beginnings of the legal framework. There is an Expo precinct is declared. South Brisbane, as it was known then, it was a pretty run-down area. It had been warehouses, it had once upon a time had wharves. It's interesting to realise that that Expo site in 1983 included Musgrave Park, even though Musgrave Park actually played no role in Expo 88. Because there had been quite successful Aboriginal protests at the Commonwealth Games in 82, there was a real concern in the state government that Expo would become just a magnet for everyone protesting on Aboriginal affairs and Indigenous rights generally. Queensland lags behind the rest of the country, particularly with regard to the issue of Aboriginal land rights. Queensland creates a whole new category of land ownership, the deeds of grant in trust, to avoid further legal action and to fend off political attacks from Aboriginal people and their supporters. The fascinating development during 1983 is at Doomadgee in the Gulf of Carpentaria, which has been formally controlled by the Brethren Church. They are in financial difficulties and they approach the state government, which decides to take over. It's interesting to speculate why would a state government at that point in time take on what was probably one of the most problematic communities in the state. It's almost as if there was a great concern and a great compassion for Aboriginal people. I suspect, however, there was more of a sense of this is going to be a problem further down if we let it go, let's nip it in the bud. What's fascinating about mining in 1983 is there are no coal exports to China. Japan is our customer. It's very focused in two areas, which is the Mackay, Rockhampton hinterland and the Ipswich, Darling Downs area. There is a lot of debate in Cabinet and in the media about the creation of a new port in southern Queensland to export coal. There is a lot of discussion about whether or not they will find a way to avoid taking coal trains through the suburbs of Brisbane. It's interesting to note those coal trains are still running 30 years later. The situation in central Queensland is quite different there because the only opposition that the coal industry encountered was from unionists, from workers. We didn't have the conservation lobby that we have nowadays. We didn't have the environmental activism that is such a feature of our contemporary world. One of the things that has become very apparent from 1983, Queensland was perilously close to being broke. Yes, there was a lot of money going into infrastructure. Yes, there was an expansion in mining, but at the same time, every other economic indicator is going backwards. So there are actually cabinet minutes which demonstrate there was a financial crisis for the government during that year. It's really fascinating to follow the cabinet discussion on the introduction of casinos in Queensland. It's quite hard to really decide who is pushing it, who's driving it, but obviously the real benefit of gambling is revenue. With a perilous economic situation, casinos make sense. In the early 1970s, Queensland moved from a public examination system to what was known as the Radford scheme, which was continuous assessment throughout the last 2 years of high school. This was a bold move on Queensland's part in the 1970s. By the early 80s, there is the opportunity to actually decide how well is this working. Queensland at that time had the lowest number of grade 12 completion in Australia. We lagged behind. We were the uneducated state. We are now on a par with every other state. In the last 20 to 30 years, Queensland has made some quite impressive progress in terms of education outcomes. We are witnessing in the early 1980s the beginnings of that revolution. Main roads and lands, they would usually have one mainframe computer per department. The whole idea of a personal computer as we can see them today, totally unheard of. Computers are only of interest to small businesses simply because they are still so expensive that people cannot buy them. But more importantly, I don't think people have actually discovered the computer as a private or a leisure tool. It's very much an accounting tool. So even though there's the beginnings of an interest in computer education for Queensland schools, the fact that such small amounts of money are allocated to it suggests it was not a high priority. The one thing that 1983 is really important for is the absolute demolition of the Liberal Party in the state election. In 1983, the Labor Party in Queensland believed that it was on the verge of gaining power. The Parliamentary Liberal Party elects Terry White as a leader to replace Lou Edwards. But Bjelke-Petersen refuses to accept White in the cabinet. He just point blank, he says, no, I will not allow that man in cabinet. And that's the crisis. That's what actually rips the coalition apart. But it takes about a week after the election before the defections of Don Lane and Brian Austin give him the numbers to form government in his own right. Well, 1983 is significant because we get the election of the Hawke government, a Labor government, which basically means the gloves are off. And the advertising material for the Bjelke-Petersen government and the state election says it all. The fineries of democracy are probably not a real strong point. The one issue that really galvanises the Bjelke-Petersen government, though, is the Franklin Dam case. Queensland immediately panicked into thinking, well, what else can the Commonwealth take over? There is a real, an ongoing war, and it affects areas like conservation, Indigenous affairs, infrastructure. But more importantly, one of the things the Bjelke-Petersen government is violently opposed to is the idea of uniform national laws. Every time somebody proposes any sort of interstate cohesion, cooperation, standardisation, Queensland always opposes it on principle.